Nidohei, private second class. That is your entire identity in the Imperial Japanese Army the day you are conscripted. Not a name. A single yellow star on a red felt collar tab. You're the newest man in the barracks, and the barracks never lets you forget it. You were drafted at 20 under the conscription ordinance and sent to a regimental depot for roughly a year of training built on repetition and exhaustion. You marched for hours. You bowed at exact angles. You learned to strip and reassemble your Arisaka rifle, the Type 38, or, if you arrived after 1939, the newer Type 99 chambered for a heavier round. Its bayonet was longer than almost any other army issued, because your instructors still believed the cold steel charge decided battles. In 1937, they were not entirely wrong yet. Your seniors called the culture around you Seishin Kaioiku, spiritual training. It meant your body belonged to the emperor before it belonged to you. A slap from a senior private was routine, not punishment. Discipline passed downward through the ranks like a debt everyone eventually collected. Historian Edward Dree, who spent decades studying the wartime Japanese army, described this internal brutality as one of its most effective tools and one of its most corrosive. Effective because it produced men who endured almost anything without complaint. Corrosive because the cruelty never had anywhere else to go but further down. What does it feel like to be nobody inside a machine built entirely on hierarchy? It feels like arriving already behind. Every rank above you has earned the right to make your day harder, and someday, if you live that long, you will inherit that right too. Your uniform was heavy khaki wool, too warm in summer and never warm enough in winter. Your pack held a rice ration, a field shovel, spare cloth sold-tabi boots, and a senimbari, 1,000 stitch belts sewn by women back home, one not from each stranger who had touched it, a charm meant to carry you through whatever came next. You did not ask whether it worked. You simply wore it the way you did everything else that year because asking was not a skill anyone had trained into you. Itohei, private first class, a second star, a little more standing, and in January 1941, a document that reshaped what your life was now allowed to mean. War Minister Hideki Tojo issued the Senjinkan, the Field Service Code, distilled into a single sentence every soldier had memorized before he could recite his own service number. Do not live to experience shame as a prisoner. It was not a suggestion. It was a redefinition of death itself, from something to be avoided into something that could, under the right circumstances, be owed. You carry that sentence with you into whatever came next: tropical heat, mountain cold, jungle rot in your boots. You wrote letters home about the weather because there was nothing else you were permitted to say that would not be read by someone above you first. You learned which senior privates to avoid and which ones had stopped caring whether you lived. Historian Saburo Ienaga, who later spent his career fighting to have Japan's wartime record taught honestly in its own schools, argued that this code did not simply prepare soldiers to die well. It removed the one exit that every other army's soldier still had: surrender. Once that door was sealed from the inside, what was left? Gocho, corporal, your first stripe, and your first squad, roughly 10 men who now looked to you the way you once looked to the man above you. In the summer of 1939, along a disputed river called the Khalkhin Gol, a Japanese army built on courage and cold steel met a Soviet force under a young general named Georgy Zhukov, built on tanks, artillery, and overwhelming coordinated firepower. The result stunned the men who lived through it. Japanese infantry charged. Soviet armor answered. The battle became one of the most lopsided defeats in the Army's modern history, and a lesson that spirit alone could not outproduce steel was learned by the men in the field long before it was learned by the men who planned the next war anyway. You were the corporal explaining to your squad why the plan had not survived contact with reality. You did it anyway. That was the job. Gunso, sergeant, a silver star now beside your yellow stripe, and a platoon's worth of men whose survival ran through your judgment more than any officer's. By late 1942, you might have found yourself on Guadalcanal, a name your command had barely heard of a year earlier and would never forget afterward. American Marines held the airfield. Reinforcement convoys were shredded before they landed. Rations ran out, then routes ran out, then men started calling the island by a different name entirely, Starvation Island. Historian John Dower, in his study of the Pacific War's racial and psychological brutality, described how both sides came to see the other less as an army and more as something to be exterminated rather than defeated. You watched men die of hunger before they ever fired a shot in anger. Was that still the war you had trained for? Malaria took men your rifle never touched. Dysentery took men the enemy never saw. Your job was to keep a platoon functioning on a fraction of its rations, to decide who was too weak to march and who only believed he was, and to be wrong about that as rarely as you could manage. There was no manual for it. There was only the next order and the men still able to carry it out. Socho, Sergeant Major, the senior NCO in your company now, the man responsible for its discipline, its paperwork, its supply requisitions, and the small daily miseries that never make it into a history book. You had likely served since the early campaigns in China, since Shanghai, since the brutal, grinding advance that culminated at Nanjing in December 1937, an atrocity so severe that international observers documented it in real time, and Japanese officers themselves privately admitted the killing had gone beyond anything the campaign required. You did not order what happened there. You were, perhaps, a witness to what a command culture without restraint could produce once it slipped its leash. You kept the company's books in order. You kept the machine moving. That was what a sergeant major did, whatever the machine happened to be doing around him. Shoy, second lieutenant. A commission now, training completed at the Rikkigun Shuriken Gakko, the Army Officer Academy, and a platoon that expected you to lead from the front in the most literal possible sense. Doctrine required it. If your unit was surrounded and resupply was impossible, doctrine also expected something else from you, a coordinated final attack rather than surrender, what the Army called Gyokusai, the shattered jewel. In May 1943 on the island of Attu, a Japanese garrison facing annihilation staged the war's first mass Gyokusai charge, nearly the entire remaining force killed in a single dawn assault rather than accept capture. You had memorized the Shinjinkan years earlier as a private without fully understanding what it would eventually ask of you personally. Now you were the officer whose word would decide whether your own platoon lived that sentence out. Doctrine does not carry the weight. Men do. Tai, Captain, a company of roughly 200 men on paper, considerably fewer in practice by the middle of the war. You might have served under General Tomoyuki Yamashita during the assault on Singapore in February 1942, a campaign so audaciously fast that numerically superior British and Commonwealth garrison surrendered within a week, one of the most stunning defeats in the history of the British Empire. Or you might have been on the other end of the war's arithmetic entirely, on the Bataan Peninsula that same spring, force marching thousands of exhausted American and Filipino prisoners north under conditions that killed thousands before they ever reached a camp. Victory and atrocity ran through the same years, sometimes the same units, sometimes the same men. You reported upward what your superiors wanted confirmed. You absorbed downward whatever your men could not be told. That was the interface a captain occupied, and it did not come with an instruction manual. Taisa, Colonel, a regiment now, 3 battalions on paper, far fewer men breathing by 1944. If your war took you to Burma, you may have served under Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi during the invasion of India through Imphal and Kohima in the spring of 1944, a campaign launched against the advice of nearly every officer beneath its commander, supplied by cattle expected to be eaten as the advance consumed them, and broken entirely by monsoon rains, starvation, and Allied air superiority. The retreat that followed left a road strewn with the dead that survivors later named Shirahon Kaido, the Road of White Bones. Roughly 60,000 Japanese soldiers did not come back from Imphal. You had climbed through 9 ranks and 2 decades of a hierarchy built on discipline and sacrifice to arrive at a command that a single general's ambition had already doomed before your regiment fired a shot. Did the men who died there know that? Would it have mattered if they had? You wrote your reports upward the way you always had, carefully, without the words that might have named the failure plainly. That was not cowardice. It was the same hierarchy that had shaped every rank behind you, still working exactly as it was built to work all the way to the end. Taisho, general, an army now, spread across a front you could not walk in a week. By August 1945, if you commanded within the Guandong Army in Manchuria, you presided over a force that had spent years as the empire's most feared and best equipped, and that collapsed within days when the Soviet Union finally declared war and attacked with the same combined arms doctrine that had broken Japanese forces at Khalkhin Gol 6 years earlier. History repeated the lesson your own corporals had learned in 1939. This time nobody was left to argue that spirit could still outproduce steel. After the surrender, legal tribunals held commanders directly responsible for the conduct of the men under them, whether or not they had personally issued the orders, a doctrine of command accountability that historian Ulrich Strauss later traced through the post-war trials of officers like Yamashita himself. The chain of hierarchy that had carried you upward for years now carried the weight back down onto you, in a courtroom instead of a battlefield. Jinsui, field marshal, not truly a rank in the Imperial Japanese Army at all, but an honorary title bestowed on a small handful of men across its entire history, fewer than the fingers of two hands, reserved for generals whose service the emperor himself chose to elevate above the ordinary structure of command. It carried immense ceremonial weight and, by 1945, commanded an army that no longer existed in the form that had earned it. Naidohei, private second class. That is where every one of these men began, a number on a collar, a body that belonged to someone else before it belonged to himself. 2 decades and 9 ranks later, whatever he became, general, prisoner, casualty, footnote, he started exactly where you did. Nobody, and the machine never once let him forget it.